Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Season 5 of the Vimy Foundation's podcast, Beyond the Ridge, a series exploring Canada's contributions to the First World War and the experts who continue to uncover our past. My name is Caitlin Bailey, and I am the Executive Director of the Vimy Foundation. Today, we have the pleasure to have John Moses with us. John is a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. He is a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, a recipient of the Special Service Medal for operations at CFS Alert, and the King Charles III Coronation Medal for services to museums. John is the former Director of Repatriation and Indigenous Relations at the Canadian Museum of History, and now works as Principal Consultant at Authentic Indigenous Advisory Services for Museums and Heritage. His family has many close connections to the First World War, and he has been a leading voice in raising awareness of Indigenous contributions to Canada's military history and heritage. So, John, it's lovely to have you with us. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I certainly appreciate this opportunity, Yahweh.
Wonderful. So I guess we'll start with the burning question. Can you tell us a little bit about your own path into museum work and into this work, and what drew you particularly to be focusing on Indigenous military history?
Well, I think in my own case, aside from the brief period of my own military service, I basically served in the comm research trade, communicator, research operator, trade 291 for 5 years between high school and going back to college and university. And that included my single deployment to Canadian Forces Station Alert at the northern tip of Ellesmere Island. Aside from that stint in the military, I've spent most of my working career in and around the orbit of the Department of Canadian Heritage and its various organizations, including the Canadian Museum of History and the Canadian Conservation Institute, as well as working directly within the Department of Canadian Heritage itself. Additionally, I had a couple of training and employment opportunities outside of Canada. I did one of my artifact conservation internships with the British Museum in London, England, and I was on staff at the National Museum of the American Indian for 2 years when they were still based in New York City during the mid 1990s. But after I had determined I wasn't going to be making a career of the military, I had always had this very strong interest in museums and heritage related work. And I think it actually goes back to an elective I took when I was in grade eight. I did my schooling here in the Ottawa area, and one of our history teachers at that point arranged for a group of us to visit local museums and historical sites that were all within about a day's drive of Ottawa. So I think as far west we went to Fort Henry and Kingston, and as far east we went to Fort Wellington and Upper Canada Village and things like that. It was at that early stage that it actually dawned on me that if one has a history or an interest in history, there's actually a career path in that. You can go to work in a museum, you can go to work at a historic site and that kind of thing. So I'd always had that in the back of my mind. But as I got somewhat older, I got more intrigued by some of these bigger questions having to do with the complete history of Indigenous contributions to Canada's military history and heritage overall. And certainly, I was raised in an extended family environment where it was always understood that we had, many relatives who were veterans of the two world wars in Korea. And then, if you look back even further in history, uh, coming from where we are from at the Six Nations, the Grand River Territory, there's a tradition of military service there in alliance with the British Crown that indeed goes back to the time of the American Revolution and the War of 1812 and that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
I got more interested in looking at some of these broader questions about Indigenous contributions and what were the motivations, and even very personal or detailed questions about that link between residential school attendance and later military service, because my father had been raised at the Mohawk Institute residential school in Brantford during the 1940s,
Mhm.
and subsequently he was a naval veteran of the Korean War.
Mhm.
So,
Um, it's interesting. I mean, it only takes one teacher
mhm.
to set
Yeah,
you on a path,
yeah, it's
and
true.
takes you down somewhere where
Hmm.
perhaps you didn't
Yeah.
really think about that. And I
Hmm.
appreciate your reference to the fact that if you like history, there is a job for you
Hmm.
somewhere, because frequently we're
Yeah.
told that's not the
Yeah.
case. Um,
Yeah. And that was Mr. McIntosh, by the way,
Mr.
at Green
McIntosh.
Bay Public. Yeah, so he was very very good at really motivating students and sort of getting us to think along those lines. So
Well, we'll hope that there are other Mr. McIntoshes out there for other
yeah.
people to send them
Hmm.
on. What
Yeah.
has in your case been certainly
Hmm.
a very long and dare I say notable career
Oh,
in
thank you.
this field. So
Hmm.
um, you mentioned residential schools
Hmm.
and ties to Indigenous service. Um, when you're thinking about Indigenous participation, particularly we'll talk about Canada's 20th century wars. We'll stick to
Hmm.
the 20th century wars. There are enough
Yeah.
of them.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
when you think about Indigenous participation there, what do you think is the most or several of the most important contributions that Canada as a whole should know about and remember?
Hmm. Well, I think in like just for a little bit of context, like our families from the Six Nations, the Grand
Mhm,
River Territory, which is in Brantford or near Brantford in southwestern Ontario, and that's where both my parents were born and raised, and where the majority of my extended family members continue to live and work. On my mother's side of the family, on the Montour side of the family,
mhm,
she had the benefit of being raised at home alongside her siblings in, fairly conventional Six Nations family settings, but things were rather more unsettled on my father's side of the family. On the Moses side of the family, there were actually three generations of the Moses family that were raised at the Mohawk Institute.
mhm,
So, as I say, my father was there in the 1940s. He was there under, I would have to say, exceptionally severe wartime and post-war
mhm,
conditions from 1942 until 1947. His father, my grandfather, Ted Moses, was there basically during the years of the First World War, and my great grandfather Nelson Moses was there even earlier in the 1880s. So, that makes me the first generation after three that was not sent there, of
mhm,
course, for which I'm grateful. And in fact, the Mushwell, the Mohawk Institute, had ceased operation as a residential school in 1970. But
mhm,
they each encountered, between my father, grandfather, and great grandfather, they each encountered different circumstances depending upon the decade in which they attended. When my great grandfather was there in the 1880s, the Mohawk Institute was basically being run as a missionary training
mhm,
school where likely young men and women from the Six Nations Reserve were sent to be trained as Indigenous Anglican teachers and clergy, and with the
mhm,
intention that they would be sent out west as the Dominion of Canada continued the process of signing the numbered treaties out
mhm,
west. And the intention was that you would get quote unquote educated or assimilated Indians from the eastern part of the country being sent out west as the numbered treaties were being signed and as new Indian reserves were being set up, and you would have
mhm,
Indians from the west basically Indians from the east teaching Indians out west, and using Indian
mhm.
in the usage of the time, meaning those
Yes.
subject to Canada's Indian Act legislation. So that was the environment at the Mushroom. That was the name given to the school by the Six Nations people over many
Mhm,
generations. So when my grandfather Ted was there at the time of the First World War, it was basically being run as a military themed boarding academy during that
mhm,
era of militarization that had culminated in the outbreak of the First World War itself. It deteriorated throughout the 20s and 30s, and my father and his siblings had the misfortune of being sent there, as I say, during the years of the Second World War, by which
mhm,
time any pretense of providing the children with any sort of training or education
Mhm.
had largely been dispensed with. They were
Mhm.
there to provide the forced agricultural labor that was necessary to keep the large farm operation going as a contribution to
Mhm.
the civilian food production effort on the Canadian home front during war. So those were
Mhm.
the circumstances. I think in terms of the actual contributions of people from Six Nations at the time of the First World War, just in terms of the basic sort of numbers and facts and figures, there were more than 300 Six Nations band members who volunteered to serve during the First World War. Of those, there were 292 who finally shipped overseas. And of those 292, there were 38 who didn't return. They were either killed in
Mhm.
action, died of wounds or illness, or were reported missing in action. So, with statistics like that, with the losses basically exceeding 1 in 10, that meets the dictionary definition of decimated. So
Certainly. Yeah.
you can accurately say that the
Mhm.
Six Nations troops of the First World War were decimated in their service to Canada. But so there, there was that whole history, and I can't really sort of dive into what was going on at Six Nations during the First World War without making some reference to the history behind that, because
Mhm.
historically, wherever the British Crown or the other great powers in North America were obliged to do so as a matter of economy or
Mhm.
geography. All these major forces, including the British Crown, the French Crown, the newly emerging United States, wherever circumstances dictated, they were always very eager to engage Indigenous allies for their own purposes. And
Yes.
Indigenous
Mhm.
groups either accepted or rejected or modified these
Mhm.
overtures in accordance with their own objectives. During Canada's involvement in the major wars of the 20th century, including, of course, the two world wars in Korea, you have to think that the circumstances of Indigenous troops or First Nations troops overall were unique in relation to the rest of the Canadian population at all
Mhm.
overall. So, despite the fact that we did not enjoy the full rights and benefits of citizenship at the time
Mhm.
of the two world wars in Korea, we were nevertheless at the very forefront in fulfilling abroad what many would argue is the most onerous and profound obligation of citizenship in donning uniform and
Mhm.
bearing arms against the nation's enemies. But
Mhm.
having said that, there was sort of that overarching political relationship that was expressed in different terms in different areas of the country. So for amongst Plains First Nations, for example, there was very much this notion of the treaty relationship with the
Mhm.
British Crown and the notion of the Queen as sort of the Great White Mother, quote unquote. But even that, there's a very profound notion of kinship alliance there, with one group
Mhm.
of people referring to another group of people as being the mother and that kind of thing. So
Mhm.
there's a whole subculture in behind all that that we don't have time to go into, but it's not as quaint or as naive as it might sound on the
Yeah.
surface. It's very it's very
Mhm.
profound what's at stake there.
Mhm.
But with our people of the Six Nations Confederacy, we have this notion of the Covenant Chain Wampum Accord with the British Crown and with the original five and then later Six Nations Confederacy, which is basically this notion of mutually beneficial trading and economic partnerships during peace and military alliance during war. And so that was something that was certainly part of the underlying political context when the Six Nations, the Grand River Territory, was trying to decide how to
Mhm.
position themselves in relation to the Dominion of Canada's war
Mhm.
effort and with the larger British Crown war effort as a whole. So
Mhm. And it's, I think, maybe important to note for our listeners as well that that negotiation is a nation-to-nation negotiation that exists outside of the Dominion of Canada's decision
yeah,
to go to
that's right.
war,
Yeah, and
regardless of
there's a
how
whole
it's presented.
yeah,
It is,
that's
you know.
yeah. That's true, and it was an extremely contentious
Mhm.
issue when the war broke out in 1914 as to whether the Six Nations Confederacy would support the war effort or if
Mhm.
they would remain neutral. And
Mhm.
indeed, during early days, when the reserve was still under the traditional political leadership of the Six Nations Confederacy of hereditary chiefs and clan mothers, the attitude was that we would be like the Swiss. We would be diplomatically
Mhm.
neutral until such time as King George V formally sought Six Nations
Mhm.
military alliance consistent with the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt, or until such time as the German Kaiser declared war against the Six Nations Confederacy of
Mhm.
Iroquois and allied Indian nations, we'd be diplomatically neutral. But
Mhm.
notwithstanding that official stance going out there, as I say, there were more than 300 Six Nations troops that volunteered to serve despite that official position of
Mhm.
the Confederacy chiefs, and so that was in itself was a huge challenge to the authority of the Confederacy chiefs. And in fact, when the surviving number of Six Nations veterans returned home in 1918 and 1919 and beyond, they assumed leadership of a pre-existing political movement that actually
Mhm.
agitated for the introduction of Indian Act style band council
Mhm.
elections as an alternative to the hereditary system of governance,
Mhm.
and that's been a
Mhm.
huge, that's been continues to have implications at Six Nations even today.
Absolutely. And across, some of the wider nations, I
Hmm.
would imagine as well.
Yeah,
There continues to be a
yeah,
tension between the
yeah,
elected
hmm,
chief system and
yeah.
the
Yeah.
hereditary
And
system.
yeah. And again, like that, there are all these unanticipated outcomes
Mhm.
to Indigenous involvement in Canada's war effort. And this played out unique way it played out at Six
Mhm.
Nations. Well, in other
Mhm.
reserves too, just as you say, there were those, even today, those extended families that support traditional systems of governance, whereas other extended families might support the Indian Act band council
Mhm.
system. There were losses to Indian Reserve land bases, and in
Mhm.
some places, Indian Reserve lands were appropriated
Yes.
by the government for military purposes with the
Mhm.
intention that they would be returned to Indian hands following the war, but that didn't always happen. And even
Mhm.
increased marital breakdown with an increased number of children winding up in residential schools
Mhm.
during wartime as their own family members, including parents, departed for their own military service or perhaps to work off reserve in
Mhm.
the war related industries, and other
Mhm.
role models and elder siblings who otherwise would have been the caregivers were siphoned off for military purposes like that. So there are all
Mhm.
sorts of unanticipated outcomes to military service, quite aside from the possibility of death or injury to those who
Mhm.
actually served overseas in uniform. There are all these things playing out on the Indigenous home front as well.
On the yeah, and there's the agricultural land appropriations for returning
Hmm.
veterans, which
Yes,
very
yeah, as
few
well.
Indigenous veterans had the opportunity to apply for or benefit from. So,
Right.
you spoke about land being appropriated for military use
Hmm.
during the war, and
Yeah,
then there's a second kind of, certainly in the prairies context, there's a second
yeah,
eating away of
yeah.
nation territories that were used for or bought up
That's right. Yeah, like
for
under the
agricultural usage
yeah,
and
yeah.
agricultural
Because
land grants.
correct. Yeah, like under the terms of the Soldier Settlement Act,
Yes.
as it was called when it was being applied to status Indian registered
Mhm.
band members living on reserve, if the newly returned veteran was in fact a status Indian registered band
Mhm.
member, and they were allotted so many acres of land to start farming, on their own. They weren't just given sort of federal or provincial crown land. It came from their Indian reserve,
Mhm. Mhm.
and it was turned over to them in fee simple ownership. And so it ceased being part of the Indian Reserve land base in the
Yes.
collective sense and became
Mhm.
the private property of the individual Indigenous veteran farmer, and of course that
Mhm.
created tensions in its own right too. So
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely, and then can be sold individually,
yes, yeah,
to, whomever
yeah,
was willing to purchase it.
yeah. Hmm.
So we do have a question a little bit later,
Hmm.
on wider impacts that I think we've
Hmm.
we've gone through them, but I have a couple
Yeah,
more follow-up questions on
yeah,
wider
sure.
impacts. But
Hmm.
one of the things that you mentioned is, the Montour family,
Hmm.
and that your mother is a Montour, and some of our
Hmm.
listeners are probably familiar with, your grandmother, Edith Montour.
Yeah. Well, that
Um,
was sort of another sort of yeah, that's a huge story in its own right. My grandmother Edith Anderson Montour, well, Montour's her married name. Her
mhm,
Anderson was her maiden name. She was born in 1890 on the Six Nations Reserve, and as a young woman, she had determined that she wanted to become a nurse. That was
mhm,
her calling, and that was her ambition. But unfortunately, under Canada's Indian Act legislation of that era, if you were a status Indian registered band member who is in receipt of any sort of a technical training or a recognized academic credential, including being, for example, a registered nurse.
mhm,
If you were in receipt of any sort of a professional designation like that, you were automatically considered to be assimilated into the broader society, and
mhm,
therefore your name would be stricken from the band membership rolls, and you would be obliged to move off reserve. But
mhm,
in my grandmother's own case, her way around that was to actually take her nurse's training in the United States, sort of
mhm,
beyond the purview of the local Indian agent, the band office, and everything else like that. So she went down to New York City in 19 well, she graduated in 1914, I believe it was. So she had um, taken her nurse's training in New York City, and she was actually living and working as a public health nurse and a school nurse in New York City when the
mhm,
Americans entered the First World War in 1917. So she volunteered for service as a nursing sister with the U.S. Army Nurse Corps of the American
mhm,
Expeditionary Force, and she actually served overseas in France for pretty well 2 full years from 1917 until it was well into 1919 when
mhm,
she was returned home. But anyway, so that was her experience. She served overseas in France with an American base hospital at a small town called Vitel, which was on the Moose Argonne sector and sort of
mhm,
that area of the American fighting. Anyways, when she returned to New York City in 1919, those previous Indian Act restrictions of which I spoke had been removed in the meantime. So
uh-huh,
she, by that stage, she was able to return home to the Six Nations Reserve, which is what she did. And there she met and married my grandfather, and they raised a family, including my own mother. And
mhm,
yeah, Grandma continued nursing and working as a midwife on the reserve right up until she finally retired at some point in the 1960s, by which
mhm,
point she was into her 70s at that
mhm,
point. So she passed away in April of 1996, just a few days short of what would have been her 106th birthday. So
mm,
she had a remarkably long life and a
long
productive life
life,
and
yeah,
adventurous life, and the sense of having been a great war U.S. Army nurse, and then
mhm,
having essentially been a pioneer of Indigenous healthcare in this country.
mhm,
And she was
mhm,
also involved in Indigenous voting rights
mhm,
too. So that
mhm,
was she was quite remarkable. Aside from her work as a medical pioneer and a nursing pioneer, she was also notable for her political activity in terms of the Indigenous vote and that kind of
mhm,
thing.
mhm.
So
She changed a lot of lives.
yeah, she was inspirational for,
Yeah,
a number
for
of
many people.
healthcare professionals from Six Nations, and including like her own daughter, my mom Helen. Helen herself followed her mother Edith into the nursing profession, and
Mhm,
Helen was one of the founding members of the Canadian Indian Nurses Association
mhm,
back in the 1970s, and then Helen in her own way was, served as a role model and mentor to a number of young healthcare professionals too in her generation. So
mhm.
my mom's still with us happily. She's 95 now and lives not too far from us here in Ottawa. So
Go Helen.
Mm. Yeah.
We'll we'll hope
Yeah.
she makes 106.
Yes. Yep. Indeed.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So there are close connections in your family to the First World War. You mentioned your grandfather, there's your grandmother.
Hmm.
How has how did their experience shape your understanding of Six Nations' role as a whole in the
Hmm.
First World War, and
Yeah.
what Six Nations citizens of that nation engaged to do?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think one of the sort of the interesting historical facts about when war was declared in 1914, and it seems to be overlooked now in retrospect, but just as during the bicentennial of the War of 1812 here in
Mm-hmm.
Canada from 2012 through 2014, so too in central and eastern Canada from 1912 until 1914. There was a huge round of sort of War of 1812
Mm-hmm.
centennial commemorative events. There were reenactments of the Battle of Queenston Heights,
Mm-hmm.
not too far from the Six Nations Reserve at all. And there was all sorts of commemorative things happening around commemorating the great Chief Tecumseh and that kind of thing. So ironically, in 1914, just as all of these War of 1812 centennial commemorations were drawing to a close, the First World War breaks out. And so the question for the Six Nations becomes, okay, we've
Mm-hmm.
been making all of these assertions of our military tradition as a function of having been allies to the British Crown in 1812, 1814. Now there's apparently a world war upon
Mm-hmm.
us. How are we going to throw our weight into that? What position are we going to take? And as I referenced earlier, there was a range of
Mm-hmm.
opinions, a spectrum of opinions ranging from diplomatic neutrality to supporting the war effort through, in terms of agricultural production alone, perhaps, or indeed, at the far end of the spectrum, fully engaged with the military effort. And yeah, there was a lot of confusion on the part of the Canadian government itself in relation to status Indian
Mm-hmm.
registered band members as a whole. So under the Indian Act of that era, to the extent that status Indian registered band members are basically legal minors
Yes.
or wards of the state in the eyes of
Mm-hmm.
the law, what are the implications of that for recruiting them en masse into the
Mm-hmm.
Canadian military? Can they be recruited at all? If they are to be recruited, will they serve in all Indigenous units, or will
Mm-hmm.
they be dispersed through, other units more broadly? And even this issue of to the fact that, come the victorious peacetime that no one doubted, in terms of receiving veterans benefits. It was
Yes.
announced early on that veterans benefits, and this played out during the Second World
Mm-hmm.
War as well, and during the Korean War for that matter. Veterans benefits back then were only payable to Canadian citizens. And again, to
Yes.
the extent that under the Indian Act, that Indians are not considered fully fledged Canadian citizens. Some were told erroneously that if they wanted to enlist with the hope and expectation of receiving their veterans benefits in due course, they would have to renounce their legal Indian status
Mm-hmm.
under the Indian Act and embark upon this process of enfranchisement under which
Mm-hmm.
they surrender any Indigenous and treaty rights in exchange for, a fully
Mm-hmm.
fledged version of Canadian citizenship. So that actually never happened in an organized fashion on the Six Nations. But I guess the long story short, and there's all sorts of rabbit holes we could go
Mm-hmm.
down here, but long story short, Canada's two largely Indigenous formations of the Great War were the 114th Battalion, Brock's Rangers, that was
Mm-hmm.
raised in and around Six Nations in the Brantford area, and then the 107th Timberwolf Battalion that was
Mm-hmm.
raised in and around Winnipeg.
Yes.
And so, in neither instance, whether you're talking about the 107th or 114th, were they able to raise the entire sort of
Mm-hmm.
regimental strength of, say, eight to
Yeah.
900 people,
Mm-hmm.
but they did, in fact, raise about half of that
Mm-hmm.
number. So there was an Indigenous company within the 114th Battalion. When they arrived overseas, a portion of them, including sort of the regimental color party and honor
Mm-hmm.
guard, they were hived off to go on a fundraising tour throughout northern England and into
Mm,
Scotland to
mhm.
sell war bonds and that kind of thing. That would have been during the autumn of 1916. But soon after that, the 114th Battalion was disbanded,
Yes, yeah.
with the remaining most of their members being transferred into the 107th Battalion, the 107th Timberwolf
Mhm,
Battalion. And so it was in the, in the ranks of the 107th Battalion that most Six Nations troops actually saw service at the Western Front. So
mhm,
they were designated a pioneer unit, so they were fully trained infantrymen. But aside from that, they undertook battlefield construction
yes, yeah.
work and that kind of thing. And indeed, before the end of the war, it was during the summertime, I believe, of 1918, they were transferred into the ranks of the Canadian Engineers. So
Mhm,
in today's terminology, they were what's called combat engineers. Back
mhm,
then, they were infantry pioneers. So they were engaged. In, there were Six Nations troops in the ranks of the 107th at Vimy Ridge.
mhm,
Even more heavily, in their heaviest involvement was in the fighting for Hill 70 in August
mhm,
of 1917, and I think it was then and there that they sustained their heaviest losses.
mhm,
And as they say, by the summer of 1918, the 107th itself was disbanded, and they were rolled into existing formations of the
mhm,
Canadian Engineers. So that's how they
mhm,
ended the war. But
mhm,
it's
mhm.
been documented, like even some of the the famous graffiti that's known in the chalk
Yes, yeah.
caves beneath Vimy Ridge. There are a handful there. I think there's one. I forget the names off the top of my head, but there's graffiti there carved into the chalk that mentions the Mohawk Institute. It mentions the 114th Battalion. It mentions the 107th Battalion. So this all sort of shows up in the soldiers' own folklore, in the sense that they were sort of marking their territory and perhaps commenting on where they came from in Canada, and then aside from that, the different units that they had served in previously or that they were serving in now, and so.
Mhm. And to your knowledge, those 2 battalions were the only largely Indigenous battalions. The experience of other Indigenous,
Well, there was also
servicemen would have been
there was
within,
also
other structures,
yeah, like
and
there were Indigenous troops in every branch of the
yes.
service, and by the Second World War, in every branch of the service, and in every rank from private up to
Mhm,
brigadier. It was actually Oliver Martin, who was a Six Nations band member. He had served, yeah, in the 114th Battalion, was
mhm,
transferred to the 107th Battalion, transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, Royal Air Force. He finished the war as an RAF fighter pilot. He stayed active in the Canadian militia during the interwar years.
mhm,
And come the Second World War, he was once again with the regular force, appointed
mhm,
as a brigadier in charge of infantry training within the British Columbia military
mhm,
district. So quite a remarkable service career
mhm,
there. But just think about some of my other Moses family members. There were two great uncles of mine, so these would have been elder brothers to my father's father. There was Arnold Moses, who served throughout the war as a sapper with the 107th. Well, again, initially with the 114th, and then transferred to the 107th. He survived the war, and then an older brother, Jim Moses, who joined as a commissioned officer, and he was one of the Indian officers of the 114th Battalion. Subsequently transferred to the 107th, and then, like Oliver Martin, transferred into the Royal Flying Corps and Royal Air Force, and he was actually reported missing and later confirmed killed on April the 1st of 1918, which
mhm,
is significant within RAF history because it was on that date that the Royal Flying Corps, which was basically a formation of the British
mhm,
Army at that point, was amalgamated with the Royal Naval Air Service to create the Royal Air Force
mhm,
proper. So it's an interesting historical footnote that one of the first battle casualties of the famed
mhm,
RAF of later Battle of Britain
Yes.
fame and
Yeah.
Dam Busters raid fame and
Mhm.
everything else like that was actually a Canadian Indian
Mhm.
from Six Nations. So,
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Do you, off the top of your head,
mhm,
as a quiz,
mhm,
the um, representation of serving Six Nation members versus the population, do you
mhm.
have a stat for that? What would that percentage be, do you think?
Well, it was certainly, as I say, there were the population, the on-reserve population of Six Nations in 1914 would have been around 4,000 people altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that, as I say, there were more than 300 men that volunteered to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And so, well, if you factor in my grandmother, who was down in
Yes.
the States
Yeah.
by that point, one woman as well. But that figure of more than 300 men of military age from one Indian Reserve community, the basis of which, the economic
Mm-hmm.
basis of which was farming and agriculture, that was a
Mm-hmm.
huge,
Mm-hmm.
that was a huge dent to the
Yeah.
manpower available for the farming and other purposes on the
Mm-hmm.
reserve. So I haven't actually sat down and done the math of that, but generally speaking, it's been stated in many different sources that the rates of enlistment amongst status Indian registered band members exceeded that of the Canadian
Yes.
population at large.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
mhm,
That's a fairly common,
yeah,
statistic across the
mhm,
board that that was
yeah,
that was certainly the case. And
mhm,
for a nation like Six Nations, where
yeah,
you're doing labor that requires men specifically,
mhm,
then
mhm,
you're hampering
yeah,
your ability to prosper
right.
economically as a result.
That's right.
Um,
Mhm,
so we've spoken a little bit about the wider impacts of military service on Indigenous
mhm,
communities. The question I guess I have, tying back into
mhm,
residential schools specifically, is
mhm,
you mentioned the casualties on Six
mhm,
Nations, and I
yeah,
imagine that then has a ripple effect into the families who are then forced to put their children in residential school care because they don't have
yeah.
a
Well,
male
it certainly
provider.
Yeah, it certainly increases the economic and social hardships and that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. And I think in my own, well, it doesn't necessarily apply in the case of my own family. Like I say, when my grandfather, Ted Moses, I believe he was born in the year 1900. So he would have
Mm-hmm.
been in his mid to late teens during the years of the First
Mm-hmm.
World War. There was another elder brother, Jess, who was might have been either a year older or a year younger than Ted, and he was actually drafted under the military under the
Mm-hmm.
1917 Conscription Act. He was actually drafted into the Canadian military, and the family had to go through all sorts of there was an appeals process
Mm-hmm.
saying, basically with the father of that family, Nelson Moses, saying, look at, I'm trying to run a fairly large farm on the reserve here by reserve standards. It was a fairly large farm, fairly prosperous farm. One of my sons is in the residential school. I've got two sons overseas right now. There was Arnold
Mm-hmm.
Moses, who was served as a private throughout the war with the 107th. He survived. By that point, Jim Moses had already been reported missing in action. And
Mm-hmm.
so Nelson Moses is saying, look, I can't afford to lose another son to conscription. Otherwise the farm operation
Mm-hmm.
is going to fold and you're going to be losing
Mm-hmm.
that productivity towards the food production effort. So there were things like that. It was, yeah, Jess had been conscripted, and I think they were still sort of appealing the whole process by the time the armistice occurred in November of 1918. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so, all these things from within the space of one family, you
Mm-hmm.
can see all these different outcomes, including residential school attendance, served in the military overseas but survived, served in the military overseas but was killed in action. Um, attempting to stay home to help run the farm that isn't that but you're conscripted anyways and stuff like
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
And again,
Mhm.
like even at the time that all this was unfolding, the law had not been fully defined, because by the
Mhm.
end of the war, the government conceded that yes, status Indian registered band members are not liable for conscription under the
Mhm.
Military Service Act.
Mhm.
But they were
Mhm.
still, meanwhile,
Yeah. Yeah.
the one guy had received his
Mhm.
draft notice nevertheless.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
all that to say, those who were inclined to go, they went early. If
Mhm.
they were going to be serving at all, they would have made their intentions known by certainly the autumn of 1914 kind of thing. And so it
Mhm.
was that,
Mhm.
that 292, they had made their intentions known very early on. So,
Yeah, relatively
mhm,
early on.
mhm,
The one of the things I guess that and the question when I am talking to people about Indigenous service,
mhm, mhm,
we have questions from people who are, you
mhm,
know, not familiar with
mhm,
Canada's Indian Act and the
mhm,
various ways that that has played out. And the question that people always ask, and I suppose you probably get asked this as well,
mhm,
is there's a very profound sense of doubleness in that
mhm,
service of
mhm,
serving and
mhm,
going to war, and as you said, taking part in a very dangerous and difficult piece
mhm.
of citizenship,
Yeah.
while also, as we've mentioned, being legally considered a minor
Mhm.
and not
Yeah.
benefiting from the same rights and
Mhm.
not benefiting from pensions and
Mhm.
all of the things that
Yeah.
existed for Canadian
Mhm.
citizens. And so what do you think, how do you make sense of that
Yeah.
duality? What is that
Yeah. Well,
legacy mean
agreed.
for
There's so
you?
many contradictions there. And, the thing to keep in mind is that each Indian Reserve community across the country is its own subculture with its own
Mhm.
unique history and circumstances. And even amongst the various extended families that make up any Indian Reserve
Mhm.
community, there's a variety of individual responses as well. So,
Mhm.
as I say, with some Six Nations band members, their motivations in enlisting were primarily material, and in that sense, perhaps even indistinguishable by other Canadians. They wanted the promise of
Yeah.
regular food and
Mhm. Yeah, a pair of
payment
boots.
and clothing. Yeah, and
Yeah.
like everybody,
Yeah.
everybody always hopes the best for themselves, so
Mhm.
nobody's expecting not to come back home in one
Mhm.
piece and everything else like that. So they're looking towards the perceived material benefits. But as I say, in some communities, given their own unique history of political relationships with the Dominion
Mhm.
government and with the British Crown, they do indeed have these very particular notions of political alliance. And for us at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, and it's nothing to be taken lightly, there was this very strong notion that we are not subjects to the British Crown, but allies of the British
Mhm.
Crown. We will hold up our end of the bargain in respect of the Covenant Chain
Mhm.
Wampum Belt Accord, which again is trading and economic partnerships and peace and military alliance and war. And so, amongst those who were sort of more future oriented and looking forward to that victorious peacetime that no one doubted, they felt that come peacetime, the fact of their recent military service overseas could be leveraged on the national and
Mhm.
international stage to help promote the cause of
Mhm.
Indigenous, or at least in my particular case, Six Nations sovereignty. So,
Mhm.
basically saying no less than, the War of 1812, 1814, we acted as military allies to the British Crown. So too in the Great World War just ended, we're still able to,
Mhm.
notwithstanding our by this point exponentially smaller numbers, we're still able to field a military force when it comes right down to it. So whether in terms of military allyship or economic clout that is, would have been represented by the reserve's agricultural output from all the farming, they're saying, look at we're still players. We still have a
Mhm.
seat at the table here, or we should have a seat at the table. So,
Mhm.
let's talk. So I would have to
Mhm.
say that the individual motivations varied from the material to the political in that sense.
Mhm.
So,
Absolutely, which I think
mhm,
is that is reflective across the certainly
mhm,
across the CEF experience, where
yeah,
some people were the CEF, though it is known, the Canadian Expeditionary
mhm,
Force, though it is
mhm,
seen now as very Canadian, was in fact not.
mhm,
Um,
yeah,
and the
mhm,
largest enlisting group was
mhm,
were immigrants, recent immigrants
mhm,
from the United
mhm,
Kingdom, who had
yeah,
various reasons for wanting to be implicated
mhm,
voluntarily in the
yeah,
war. And that when you get into
mhm,
1917 and 1918, and that group is
mhm,
gone, and
yeah,
you're looking now at people who are farming, people who are
mhm,
coming, who had come to Canada from the Scandinavian countries, who are looking, saying,
yeah,
well, I came here to
mhm,
farm. I didn't really come here to go back
yeah,
to Europe and fight a war.
yeah,
So it's, that kind of variance, I guess, is
yeah,
throughout it.
yeah.
And
Yeah, so there's a variety of responses, some at
mhm,
the individual level, some at at a more
mhm,
collective level and that kind of
mhm,
thing. So,
absolutely, at a family level and at a collective level, and
mhm,
then at a,
yeah,
different nation, as each
mhm,
nation works through this
yeah,
progress on their own, how
yeah,
they're responding to it or
mhm,
looking at it. Um, there is a tremendous amount of um, work to be done in the
mhm,
reconciliation field as a whole.
mhm,
Um, what we've started in the military side to acknowledge Indigenous service separately,
mhm,
and uniquely within the Canadian service culture. Um,
mhm,
there is, as you reminded me when we spoke previously about this project, the monument in Ottawa for
mhm,
Indigenous soldiers. There
mhm,
is uh, the Indigenous Veterans Day. Um,
mhm,
what do you think needs to continue to be done to ensure that this service
mhm.
is recognized and remembered?
Well, it's an interesting question because certainly, like many indigenous people, and I don't know any indigenous colleagues or whatever who have not been asked this
I'm
question of
sure, yeah, everyone
what
asks
does
you, and
what
ultimately
does
it's yeah,
reconciliation mean to you, or like mean to me
yeah,
as an individual native person. And my response has come to be, well, as far as I'm concerned, that reconciliation piece is upon mainstream
yes.
non-Indigenous Canadians to apprise themselves, to reconcile themselves to the true facts of what this
Mhm,
country's history really is. Whereas individual families and persons like myself, we can provide that truth telling part of the equation by
mhm,
making reference to our own family's experiences over the generations. And as I think about this, something I had forgot to mention during the Second World War was that there was a portion of the Six Nations Reserve that was actually set aside and appropriated for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. There was a
mhm,
bombing range that was
mhm,
part of the Six Nations Reserve between the third line and fourth line concessions. It was set aside as a bombing range. Now, they weren't using explosive bombs; they were using sort of essentially smoke bombs
mhm,
for target practice purposes and that kind of thing. But just within several minutes flying time outside the reserve, to the south of the reserve, is the small town of Jarvis, Ontario, and one of the
mhm,
British Commonwealth Air Training Plans. The bombing schools was run out of a small airfield at Jarvis, and it was
mhm,
actually their bombing range was on the Six Nations Reserve. So that in itself is another example of an Indigenous contribution to Canada's Second World War effort. The very fact that a portion of
mhm,
an Indian reserve land would be used for the purposes of a bombing range. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But there are so many stories to be told, and just because I obviously knew him personally and everything else like that, I was never never not aware of my father's residential school experience. And as I
Mhm.
say, he was there under very severe conditions from 42 until 47. I guess he left when he was 15, and that was in 1947. By 1950, he has just joined the Royal Canadian
Mhm.
Navy and is graduating from naval basic training at exactly the time that Canada becomes involved in the Korean War and is sending a naval contingent over there. So
Mhm.
he ends up serving in HMCS Iroquois during Iroquois' first Korean War deployment. So um, I kind of lost the trail of the question, but anyway, like long story short, is that Indigenous families provide the truth telling part of
Mhm.
truth and reconciliation,
Yes.
and it's an obligation upon mainstream non-Indigenous Canadians to listen to the truth that we are imparting so that they
Mhm.
can reconcile themselves to the true nature of this country's history, and that includes
Mhm.
the residential school experience. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
if I might put in a plug, there's just recently has been released a book called Behind the Bricks, which is an oral history of the Mohawk Institute, which has the dubious distinction of being Canada's longest running residential school because it was in operation in one form
Mhm.
or another from 1830 up until 1970. So
Mhm.
140 years of
Mhm.
residential school there at that one institution. But all that to say, the complete text of my father's residential school memoir forms the introductory chapter to that volume. And he was in the military from 1950 until 65. So those first 5 years were in the Royal Canadian
Mhm.
Navy, including his Korean War service. And then from 55 to 65, he was a corporal safety equipment technician with the
Mhm.
RCAF. And when he left the Air Force in 1965, it was to take employment with the civilian public service here in
Mhm.
Ottawa. And
Mhm.
at that point, he was asked by his new bosses to write an account of his residential school experiences because there was an upcoming annual conference of residential school principals and administrators that was
Mhm.
about to take place, and they were sort of experimenting with this very bold and innovative idea circa 1965 that it might be an idea to ask Indian
Mhm.
people themselves what their views and
Mhm.
impressions of the residential schools are. So my dad wrote this memoir, and it's like a 5 or 6 page memoir. It's not like book length or anything else like that, but he wrote this memoir in 1965 in which he recalls his experiences at the mush hole from 20 years previously, from
Mhm.
42 until 47.
Mhm.
But that memoir is reprinted in full in this new book Behind the Bricks, and I would recommend that to anybody's attention if you're out there and if you're sincerely interested in educating yourself as to the residential school
Mhm.
experience. That's a very useful starting point right there. So
Mhm. Super. Well, I appreciate you indulging me asking you the question that everyone asks you that I know is very frustrating,
that's
to be asked
well,
that
no, it's not.
question.
No,
Um, it is absolutely, and I think that, the as for us as a historical organization, then the
hmm
role that we have to play in this is to remind people of that duality of Indigenous service and to
yeah,
continue to have to
hmm
remind people that
yeah,
there was this continued denial of rights, there was a continued eating
yeah,
away of property, there were
hmm
very deep
yeah,
societal
yeah. Well,
consequences
in
to
fact,
dealing with this.
that would be the major talking point I would suggest, is that even moving forward, like the nature of the military service in terms of those troops who volunteered and who served overseas at the front and were, killed or wounded or injured or
Mhm,
perhaps survived and came home. That's certainly one part of the story, and it is military history, so perhaps the largest part of the story. But think about the Indigenous home front as
mhm,
well and what's happening on the
mhm,
Indigenous home front, because there were unique things unfolding on Indian reserves across the country that didn't unfold with any other demographic,
mhm, mhm,
precisely because we're talking about Indian people status, Indian registered
mhm,
band members living on Indian reserves, and what all the rules and regulations
mhm,
in and around the Indian Act and other related legislation. Well, what that was sort of another layer to the onion
Hmm.
there. So,
Absolutely. And continues to have, as we mentioned earlier,
hmm
reverberations today when we're
hmm
looking at forms of Indigenous self-governance and what is
hmm
viewed as
yeah,
being,
yeah,
the
and
way
unresolved land
forward.
claims as
Yes,
well. Yeah,
absolutely.
so
Yeah, yeah, for
mm,
sure. So I do appreciate it, John. Thank you so much. It's
thank
absolutely a
you.
pleasure to hear your insights and your
Mhm.
knowledge on this particular subject, and the contribution of Indigenous peoples to Canada's military history, and sharing your own legacy of service and the legacy of your family. I think is
You.
for
Mhm.
um, for our listeners certainly absolutely fascinating, and an important thing that I hope people will spend more time learning about,
Mhm.
and benefit from your father's memoir and from the book that is coming out. Um,
Yeah.
I'd like to also thank our listeners for joining us for season 5 of Beyond the Ridge. And we will continue to explore, uncover, and share the stories that shape our understanding of Canada and the First World War. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you. Nyawai.